About a decade ago, I read an article in the American National Geographic magazine, to which I subscribed. And the article was about how Americans were eating their way to death because of the food which they ate, or something to that effect. The article was highlighting the condition of obesity in the United States. Obesity has become a condition which is responsible for the deaths of thousands of Americans in a year. And the cause of obesity, according to the research in this article, is in the food that Americans eat as a people. And the situation, I'm sure, still remains the same. Today, I would like to discuss how the food industry, upon which we so entirely depend for our daily lives, has become the major existential threat to our survival as humans. I do so not as an expert in nutrition or in the medical field, but instead I'm approaching this discussion from a completely viewpoint of I being a victim of this industry, which I have known from the first day I landed on this planet, when I suckled at my mother's breast as a baby. It is an industry which I consider, like everybody else, to be life-saving and sacred to my life. The question is it actually the case? The food industry in the world today serves a population of about 8 billion to ensure that food is available to this large number of human beings inhabiting this planet. And also, you have to take into account the relative population growth annually, which has to run parallel to the supply of food. When I was in China on one of my visits to that country, I asked a Chinese friend of mine how they managed to eat almost everything, including snakes, which are not a delicacy in my country, Zambia. And here is his answer. If we became selective about what we ate in China, we would actually starve because of the large population of the country. So the Chinese are not selective because they have to ensure that the large population of about 1.3 billion must have access to food. This applies to many countries. With a population of 1.53 billion in Africa, Africa's production of food relative to its consumption falls way below the demand. And consequently, Africa has to import approximately $50 billion worth of food. And most of it comes from Europe. And this food is not organic. It is mostly, if not the whole of it, processed or refined. But here is the problem. The problem is that Africa does not have institutions, regulatory institutions, to ensure that the food that comes from these countries is safe for human consumption and is not hazardous to our health. Our regulatory regime is either poor in technology or corrupt to enable it to protect the citizens of this country and the continent at large. So, there lies the biggest threat to our life. From a commodity called food, which we have to consume every day. No human being can do without food. Dr. Michael Greger, an American medical doctor, has written a book which is entitled How Not to Die. Not that you will not die, but how not to die from chronic diseases that mostly come from the food that we eat. And he lists a number of them, which I can read to you from the book, and you can take your pick. Coronary heart disease, lung disease, brain diseases such as strokes, digestive cancers, infections which are respiratory, diabetes, high blood pressure, of which I'm a victim myself, liver disease, cirrhosis and cancer, blood cancers, leukemia and lymphoma, kidney disease, breast cancer, suicide, prostate cancer, and Parkinson's disease. According to Michael Greger, he recommends that a plant-based diet could actually go a long way in preventing you from these conditions, or in some exceptional cases, reverse the conditions. But the point he makes is that these conditions are caused by the food that we eat. He goes further and says in the book that a number of deaths that take place in the United States are actually preventable because they come from the food that the Americans eat. So, where do we go then from here? The problem that we have is that Africa and Zambia, my country, has become so dependent on GMO seeds and GMO processed foods. The food that we consume today does not only have a problem with the availability or supply, it has problems in genetics, in the way it is produced, in the processing system, in the preservation of that food, the storage, and all these stages require either chemicals to be used in production and preservation, or at every stage of these foods, there must be some chemicals applied. And it is those chemicals that end up in our bodies, it is those chemicals that end up in our bloodstream, and according to Greger, become the cause of the conditions, the chronic conditions that we have become susceptible to as individuals and as countries. During the time when I stayed with my grandmother in the village, a period that I'm so proud of, I used to see my grandmother prepare meals like meat and fish for long, long hours before she could serve them to us as part of the meal. And I used to wonder why. when urbanization took root, we were told by those in the nutrition field that don't cook your meat, don't cook your food for a long time, because then you kill the vitamins and other nutrients in the food. Now, one today goes to a restaurant, and I'm again a victim of that. And when you place your order for meat or fish, and you ask the restaurant people how long it will take, they will tell you 10 to 15 minutes. The food is ready. So we have abandoned our traditional way of cooking because we've been told that that is primitive. And what we are doing now is to actually consume the very chemicals that are in the food that we order at a restaurant. Even in our homes, the cooking methods now, we use modern stoves or cookers, and the food gets ready in quote unquote in a very short period of time. Meaning that the rest of the chemicals get processed by our bodies. And I'm sure my grandmother knew, even during that time, from the non-organic plants, that she needed to prepare the food for a long time on a log fire that simmers slowly, and hence my coming out of that environment healthy. So where do we go from here? Where we go from here is that the African Union, as the umbrella body of African countries, needs to forge a common agenda. And this agenda, in my view, must be to bring resources together, to marshal resources together of the 54 countries and set up a research institution and invest in research so that Africa can start producing non-GMO seeds and non-GMO food, which would be health for us to consume on this continent and the world over. But this task cannot be undertaken by one country alone or a regional bloc. And hence my view that the AU must pick up this as an agenda. But let me say one thing here from my experience as the former Minister of Justice, that I did attend, I was privileged to attend summits of heads of state in Addis Ababa. I sat in those meetings. I interacted with some heads of state. I listened to the debate in the chamber. I didn't see any group of African heads of state that would actually worry that we are being invaded as a continent with the food which is a danger to our very survival. I walked away from those meetings every time distraught, with very little hope that the continent of Africa has a future and a position in this world. Apart from research in non-GMO foods and seeds, Africa needs to invest in the setting up of pharmaceutical industries so that we are able to produce our own drugs. And if there is any lesson that we should draw today, it is from the COVID-19 pandemic. When that pandemic broke out, it was clear that the developed countries were saying to us that they do not owe us our health. We were very low on the scale of survival as far as we are concerned. And hence, my plea that Africa needs to look into this area of the pharmaceutical products. COVID-19, I'm sure, is not the last pandemic that Africans are going to experience. Africa needs to move forward and break into the modern frontiers of knowledge, which are based on research, scientific research, and not witchcraft. But this knowledge requires investment, massive investments, colossal amounts of money. It is never given to anybody free. It will not be given to us free by anybody. Knowledge, we must search for it, and knowledge, we must find it. And knowledge, we must use it for our survival as a people. I here remember Florence Nightingale's biography about her service as a nurse during the Crimea War in 1853. A war that was between Russia and the alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire over the region of Crimea. Russia lost that war. And if you want to understand the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, you have to go back to that history of the Crimea War of 1853, which ran up to 1856. But that's a story for another day. For today, I raise Florence Nightingale because of her campaign during that war to raise awareness in British society that the British soldiers were dying in large numbers from cholera. The church at the time went into prayer, as I'm sure it will do even today. Florence Nightingale's position was that the British government needed to set up a commission of inquiry, which the government finally did, to actually delve into the causes of cholera, which was later established was due to the squalid and unsanitary conditions in which the British soldiers lived. And it was our position that cholera cannot be eradicated through prayer alone. She won the day because she was proven to be right. The point I'm making is there is no substitute for knowledge. And I canvassed this matter in episode 3 of my podcast. We need, as Zambia, to invest in this area of breaking into the new frontiers of knowledge. We need to protect ourselves from the food that is coming in, which is a danger and hazardous to our health. But this is not only about those of us that live in urban areas. Because of the extinction of non-GMO seeds, even in our villages, our people in the village have been forced to cultivate and plant GMO seeds. They eat GMO food as much as we do in the urban areas, and they have become vulnerable to the very chronic diseases that we experience in the urban areas, which are offshoots of what we call modernity and urbanization. The problem is that the folks in the village have very little understanding about the instructions that are given to them regarding how to take these drugs, when to take them, and why they should take them. The result is that you have a population which is supposed to sustain our economy, but which is physically not healthy. And this is the population that lives on the fringes of our economy and has hence become unproductive. Not because those people are lazy, but because they have to run every now and then to go to clinics and get drugs to sustain their knife-edge livelihood. Why is this so? Because the traditional way of herbs being used for treatment of even minor ailments like diarrhea and colds have been done away with. They've been characterized as demonic. They've been characterized as primitive. And yet, here is Michael Greger, who is going back to the very, very cooking methods that my grandmother taught me, or which I saw my grandmother use. They were initially called primitive. Today, we are being told to go back to a plant-based diet. Today, we are being told that the cooking methods used then are preferable for our health. Everything that was dubbed as primitive is today being considered as life-saving. Again, history favors the writer. Those who control history control the world. Some of you have been asking me on my Facebook page what books I'm reading now. Well, I'll show you two of the books that I'm reading now. One of the books I'm reading is this one, which is entitled The Original Sin. Original Sin is written by a guy called Jack Tepper and Alex Thompson. Original Sin: President Biden's decline, its cover-up, and his disastrous choice to run again, the subheading. The other book that I'm reading is entitled The Divine Economy. Divine Economy is written by a French professor, Paul Seabright. The Divine Economy, how religions compete for power, wealth, and people. So I'm reading 2 books at a time. In fact, there is a third one, a fiction book, but based on research by Ken Follett, which is entitled The Evenings and the Morning. If you have found this video helpful, please give me your comment and subscribe. Thank you.